Welcome to Vision 360, where we look at cybersecurity from every angle, from technical foundations to executive decision-making and the leadership context. I am your host, Matthew Webster, and I work with cybersecurity executive leaders to align cybersecurity with business priorities, translating technical risk into a language leaders can act on. My perspective comes from decades of experience in the field, including multiple CISO roles and years working directly with leadership teams to strengthen governance, leadership, and risk alignment at the executive level. My guest today is Mahdi Zanjani. He is a cyber sovereignty legal expert and digital governance consultant specializing in international law, privacy, AI regulation, and digital rights. His work focuses on helping organizations navigate and evolve legal and geopolitical challenges of our increasing digital world. So Mahdi, welcome. I want to thank you very much. So I gave a precursory introduction. So if you want to take a minute or so to introduce yourself better than I can, could you please go ahead and do so?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That's basically what I am, who I am. And what I would add is that I also consult startups and scale-ups on the practical level regarding all of the regulations in Europe, from GDPR to AI Act to NIS2, and yeah, all of the regulations.
Fantastic. So for the people who are listening to this podcast, I'm in the US and we have somebody in Europe, and that changes the whole ball game for some of the conversations. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we start to go through this. But let's go ahead and dive into this today. So when we talk about data sovereignty, we're going to start very slow here. What exactly are we talking about, and what does the term mean in practice, not just in theory?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question to start the conversation. What does data sovereignty mean? And we have the data aspect of it and also the sovereignty aspect of it. For me, it's at least in these days, it's three aspects of data sovereignty that we are tackling on the practical side of things as well as the theoretical side of things. The first one is exposure. How much of your data is being exposed to other regions, other regulations, other technical infrastructure. The other one is inference. How much of your data is the basis of training AI and all of the language models. That inference, that's information from your original data. And if you can handle and control the original data, the inference is still out in the wild. And the third one is the scope. What is the extent to which you have sovereign control over your data regarding where your data is sitting, and also how you can control the data flow and all of that. So data sovereignty in a kind of nutshell for me would be that combining all of these three aspects of scope, exposure, and inference to understand what is the flow of data and who controls the starting point and ending point of this flow.
So I think that's very important when we consider something like that. From a certain standpoint, I think most people are aware of GDPR who are watching this particular podcast. But why else do you think this is such an important from a European perspective, especially over the last decade or so beyond GDPR? What is your perspective on that?
To be honest, this is a fascinating conversation because after AI entered the market, GDPR is basically from 2016 or 18 when it was fully operationalized. But the AI is literally 2022, basically. So there is a gap of what the rule was for, and then the new technology that took over the market. So in a kind of, in a sense, GDPR protected, let's call a treasure box. That is data, which is a defensive kind of thing that you defend against. Where is the data? Where is the email? Where is the cookie? All of that. And it's a static kind of data. But when I had the conversation with a couple of Magic Circle lawyers, and one of them is Mr. Eduardo Ustaran from Hogan Lovells, who is a great friend of mine and a mentor. We argued that in this day and age, data is becoming more of an offensive actual factor in the equation rather than just defensive. And to give you the visuals is that imagine this treasure box that you were protecting from this city to that city where the data is flowing. Each step of the way, there's one coin that drops out of this treasure box. And this coin itself turns into another treasure box wherever it goes. And this is what AI is doing these days, that the inference of information from the information that user gives it, it cannot be traced because it's all over the place. And this is why data sovereignty is becoming more and more of a kind of problem, because in the past, you could just say, okay, there's a treasure box that I can literally box in inside Europe and inside European cloud. But now it's all over the place. It's in China, it's US, and all over the place. And you need to have a control mechanism of how to trace it and how to control this pathway of data.
So that gets to be very tricky when you start to consider that, trying to look at that control, because AI is a whole different one. So I'm going to put AI to the side. We'll get back to that in a minute. But take APIs. Most businesses run off of APIs. Most of the internet traffic, and maybe the average user is not aware of this, but most that are more technical minded, that's all over APIs. It's business to business communication. And there's obviously a stopgap. If you've got an API and you're transferring data from one company to another, you don't know what's going on in that data other than asking them about what their processes are in order to protect that data. And what are they doing? How are they handling it? Do they mark the data as from company A and this is from company B when you're pulling in that information and putting it into a database or data lake, et cetera? So walk me through some of the challenges from that perspective first, and then we'll get over to AI.
Yeah, of course. One of the most fascinating challenges in this aspect is that most companies actually, at least in my own client base, they don't know what kind of data they're gathering, because most of them think they're gathering, okay, just cookies, just the email, just like the name and phone numbers. But when you go deeper with the vendors and the processors, the sub-processors, and all of them, you see, okay, the data that was supposed to stay in Europe, all of the servers are in Europe. They're literally getting the Google Analytics from US, so the data is living. Or there's a Firebase kind of authentication that is still, again, US. So this is the data flow we're talking about, that because data is becoming more and more complex, as you said, with the APIs, with all over the place, even having the servers concentrated in Europe, or at least that's my kind of place of operation, it's still going to all over the place, because you cannot concentrate everything inside Europe, because the data is being tossed around and processed all over the place in US, in everywhere outside Europe, with adequacy decisions or without adequacy decisions, which brings up the Cloud Act, which is governing the European tension between Europe and the United States.
Sure. And that's actually very important too. But I'm going to jump on one other item too. I know that they exist in the United States and a lot of other places. I'm believing that they exist in Europe as well, is the concept of a data broker. So many of us have heard that data is the new oil, data is new gold. I've heard different variations of that, but it is extraordinarily valuable. And many companies are selling their data, and a lot of times you don't actually know what's going on. I'm going to pick on an app. I was researching it for my book. It was on like a HIPAA application, health information or data. Yeah. And what happened is that data went out to 53 different companies when they countries when they sat down and analyzed it. So that adds yet another challenge for organizations to really understand where that data flow is, because you don't know. You think you're going to be using something. It seems like, oh, this seems like it's protected. Oh, it's within Europe. We trust Europe. That gets to be a bit of a challenge when you understand the technologies and you really look at how connected we are because that data is so valuable. Companies are going to bring that in and have that data go all over the place. So what are some of the challenges you see from that perspective? How can companies better protect themselves from dealing with data issues such as that? And data, and also the data brokers too, which then resell the data across countries.
Yeah, that's a very a kind of interesting point you mentioned about the data brokers because there's a funny story when I went to register a client for AWS cloud and get their special contractual clauses for the whole data transportation. I thought I saw this thing in the AWS system that whenever you enter an exposed password that has existed in the all over the like the market as you call it like with the brokers, it says okay, this password has been exposed, and we literally tried 40 passwords that the client has been using for everything else, and AWS still said okay, this password has been exposed. And this is one of the challenges that you mentioned about the brokers. And actually, all of the kind of the world is looking for a solution for that. The best example of them is the May, literally this May 2026, with IBM, that they want to give you a control key to see where every byte of your data is being stored, processed, and you have access to see the full data flow because this is the transparency problem that I even mentioned in my thesis as well, that the transparency is kind of a power imbalance that brokers are using to kind of use and leverage this imbalance to gain advantage over either like selling the data or breaches or even targeting a specific kind of audience regarding their marketing.
Yeah, and I can see that being a bit of an issue from a certain standpoint. But now let's go ahead and jump into AI. You're talking a little bit about inferences. AI, as you know, has a ton of different challenges that anybody can come in and ask for the data. They can work their way around some of the controls, like, oh, this is all our private data, but hackers can get around all of that. It's almost a well-known function when you talk about things, but talk about some of the things I'm not talking about for AI and also talk about how that starts to fit into that bigger picture because a lot of companies if you don't allow AI in your company, they're going to go use their private AI in order to put company data out there, sometimes sensitive information. This gets to be a big challenge because if you shut off access to AI, they're going to find another way around it in order to use their personal AI. There's some technical controls you can put in place to protect against some things like that, but it gets to be a big challenge, and most small organizations are not able to manage or deal with some of the intricacies of those types of connections. What are your thoughts there?
To be honest, the most kind of challenging thing about AI is that um, as I talk to a lot of privacy professionals, is that AI is targeting something other than what we expect it to target. And what I mean is that AI is targeting the profiling of identities. And one of the main problems that Europe is facing is that they want to, as President Macron literally said, we don't want our children to be raised upon ChatGPT meets DeepSeek because they have the values that are represented in the training data of the AI. So in order to do that, you need to either control that and you need to control the data set that AI is being fed on, basically, or you cultivate your own. And in order to do that, you need, exactly as you said, each company is going to get siloed in this kind of adventure towards finding the more adequate AI. And the companies and even like big law firms are doing this themselves as well. They have Recently, I heard that they are, instead of junior lawyers, they're outsourcing the ROPA or DPIA and all of the documentation necessary for GDPR to AI. But the AI they're using is more kind of a private sector AI rather than, okay, I'm going to upload the whole pitch deck or the whole business model to ChatGPT because it's a kind of open source. And the problem rising in this direction with AI is that even if you log everything, the inferences could still build another kind of separate picture. This also happened with the Clearview case with Google, that they um, literally collected millions of pictures from the internet, and they could infer actual personal data information when you feed it to an LLM. And the problem with AI is that, let's say, you give it a data that, let's say, tomorrow is your birthday, and you don't say how old are you, but in the previous data that the AI has is that you're born in, let's say, 1999, which is my birthday, and then it says, okay, it's going to be your 27th birthday. This is the inferred data. This is not the data you gave it kind of exactly. So you can log in two of the previous information, and you can even delete that. But the information that the AI has learned cannot be logged or inferred, at least by the current technology. So that's another problem, because when you say, okay, tomorrow I turn 27, you can backtrack that to finding, okay, I was born in 1999, that exact day, without actually revealing that information because it's been deleted.
Yeah, and that seems to be a big issue. And I know some of that had jumped around simply as a result of big data. That's part of what you're describing, that inference that's going on, that there's so much data. That's part of the challenge, say, with the modern cell phone, too, because you might have specific data, but then it sees, well, you're at this particular location quite a bit. That's either your work or it's your home. And they can make those sort of inferences about that. So any of the data that goes out there then can be used to identify you. So there's definitely some challenges along those roads. Any thoughts along those lines?
Um, yeah, it's just a threshold of privacy, because one of the main challenges we're facing is that the definition of privacy is kind of shifting from right-based, that started with GDPR,
Sure.
to now risk-based, which is more kind of focused on the actual danger it poses with AI Act, NIS2, DORA, CRA, and all of the regulations that are in Europe, and some of them are like globally, kind of privacy principles, to what I would call a density base, that there's this proportionality to business enablement and the legitimate kind of interest of rights versus governance, infrastructural kind of effect and influence that this AI has. And when it comes to your personal information from work, from home, from everything that can be inferred, I I assume the trajectory is that you're gonna be as much privacy as allowed to govern the whole kind of mm, mass coordination of people in this kind of country or continent or this kind of, let's say, data region, because that's the extent of your privacy and your freedom you're going to be allowed to have, because we're moving from a right-based to now density proportionality-based reading of privacy.
That's an interesting point that you're bringing in too, because there's a lot of issues to be dancing around with too. And some of it has to do with the definition, how we look at it in the United States when you say look at PII, personally identifiable information, versus how Europe looks at it. My understanding that it's much broader. If you could help people understand that from for the US audience on how that affects the European perspective, how would you bring that to the fore? How would you explain that to other people? And why is this such a big issue when you talk about cell phones and the inference data and all everything that you're referring to?
So basically, based on the GDPR's definition of private data or data subject is that everything that you can infer from any kind of person, could be an email, could be an address, could be even a cookie, and it can tie to a real person. And this is what it's called the data subject. And I don't know how it is defined in US, but basically it's that the breadcrumbs that leads to the data subject or a real person that could endanger their freedom or their financials, their all of that. So all of these breadcrumbs are called private data from the GDPR's perspective. And the person who is owner of these breadcrumbs is the data subject.
And that's very different from some of the US perspective, because then who's the data owner? And this is something I like a little bit. The data owner is, say, you and me, or the people who are underneath GDPR in that case, which case you have more
Yeah.
control, which is where the control of the data comes from. You could have things like the right to be forgotten, and that gives European a little bit of a leg up depending on the context, compared to a European perspective. Would that be your viewpoint?
Yeah, exactly. As I said, the principles upon which, data minimization, data purpose limitation, and all of the principles that GDPR is based upon is right-based, that people's right comes first. But fortunately or unfortunately, we're moving past that because people's right is a kind of the subject of kind of governance of a mass majority of people, which is a governance kind of aspect rather than right aspect, is an obligation rather than a right. So it could be minimized, it could be redefined, but if it is right, you have a total freedom of controlling your own data, which now is not actually happening all over the world.
Yeah. One of the things that's kind of a current that you're going through, it's sort of a background current of our discussion, is that it's very tough to understand and know where your data is at any given point in time. So, how much do companies really understand where their data is, especially if they're sharing the data, giving the data over to different companies, and you can put legal restrictions on it, but it's very tough to really track that, especially if you're putting things from one database to another. It's dependent upon that database. And then we've talked about a lot of other things. What are your thoughts along those lines? Because clearly, as you pointed out very clearly, it's important to protect your data, especially from a European perspective.
To be honest, in my personal experience, as well as all of the businesses that I've been in contact with, there is a kind of three layers of awareness, let's say, regarding where the data is and what is the data flow. The first one is the privacy policy. And the second one is the ROPA, or record of processing activities that GDPR requires for every literally byte of data that you collect. And the third one is the actual belief of the CTO or the CEO of what they actually are collecting from people and processing. And to my surprise, these three are worlds apart. And one of the misconceptions is that every business, or at least the startups and scale-ups that I've worked with, they literally, as soon as they lock down the domain, they go to the privacy policy page because that's in your face basically, and you have a website and you go there. But funny enough, the privacy policy is literally based upon ROPA. So you need to build the ROPA first, then build the privacy policy page based on that. And in my kind of personal experience is that the amount of data, the vendors kind of agreements, the sharing data, the kind of mutual kind of sharing and joint controllership and all of that, that is highlighted in the ROPA because you have to do that based on Article 30 of GDPR. That is worlds apart from what the privacy policy reflects, and also what the owners or CTO, CEO of the business, who are the data collectors and processors, think they are collecting. And there's a kind of mismatch between all of these three documents. And that's where I think the tension lies, because not only from the infrastructural point of view, there is no way to understand where every byte of data is going unless you literally sit down and map out the whole thing, and that is required. And the perception of your data flow is quite different as well. Like, I've had a lot of clients that they think everything is in Europe. The server is in Europe, the AI API is in Europe, everything is in Europe. But as soon as you go, okay, there's Google Analytics, okay, it's US. Or there is this authentication token that also is in US. There is this other kind of uh, cookie kind of collector also in US. And I'm literally saying, okay, brother, you told me everything is in Europe. What happened to Europe? So that's another tension that we're kind of facing these days, that no one actually knows where the data is unless they literally have to sit and collect and trace every byte of it because they're afraid to get fined.
So that's an interesting angle, because what you talked about there is you're starting to get down into the pressure of what's going on. They don't necessarily know unless they've done certain activities, like a data flow diagram is a good example. Oftentimes you
Exactly.
could do it for your own organization, but are you also doing it for the other organizations? Do you know where that data is? Are you validating that the data flow is going to be exactly as they say that is within those different organizations that are out there? So then you start to look at, you mentioned the legal side of the house, people are afraid of fines, but then you've got the GDPR, possibly the boardrooms. How would you see that pressure starting to affect organizations today, especially with small organizations who probably do not do very good data governance, especially when they're first starting out and they're startups and they're learning this whole thing? It is a complex, tangled web of pressures that are sometimes known and sometimes unknown, especially for the startup founder. Walk me through some of that, because I think that would be a fascinating topic to hear your perspective on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I see all of these kind of, let's say, founder types in three kind of categories, which is most of them are problem unaware and solution unaware. The other category is they are problem aware, solution unaware. And the third category is, which is the tiniest one, is problem and solution aware. And how I categorize these people is that most of them actually don't know what GDPR is. They literally call it a legal tax. As soon as I become a unicorn, I'm gonna pay the GDPR fee for a consultancy or for a lawyer. But how do you build, let's say, 10 stories building without actually the foundation? You cannot process 1 byte of data before you have full on privacy kind of by default system, which is why you have ROPA, DPIA, and all of them before even hitting the market. That's the first problem with the problem and the kind of solution unaware people. And the second one is interesting one because they are aware of the fines. Okay, 20 million for this, 30 million for that, and they can at least skim through the articles and get a grasp of the definition of a couple of things that are important to them. But the solution of unawareness is kind of it's still a kind of a friction point because most of them don't actually know what a ROPA is, because ROPA is the backbone of actually the data diagram and the flow of where your data is. Why are you collecting this? For how long? For whatever the reason, and all of that. So this is the second group. The third group, they actually know everything. Like they know the problem, they know the solution, but still finding a proportionately adequate way of prioritizing fixing things still requires an expertise that, because it's not their domain, they still are unaware of. And they say, okay, just give me a ROPA or give me a DPIA without understanding, okay, sure, you need a ROPA and you need a DPIA, but you need first, you need the SEC because your data is going to a non-adequate country such as the US.
Yeah. And that's that, as you pointed out, you were talking about different applications, how you're connecting in, do you actually vetted them before giving the data over to the AI model, et cetera. That's a massive tactic. The other part I want to dive back a little bit into, um, are people doing things in an unauthorized fashion, say using the AI to get their work done because your company has banned all AI. So they email themselves and then comes back. That gets to be a big challenge too, especially because you'd have to tighten up the controls, tighten up the requirements to make sure that data doesn't flow in a bad direction, because then it's going to be on their personal email system. Then it's going to be in the AI system because they sent it through the corporate email, sometimes their personal email that they're logging into on their local site. It gets to be a mess very, very quickly. I can see a lot of organizations. Is that a huge concern from a European or GDPR perspective?
To be honest, the way GDPR thinks about data flow is that you need to defend every decision. So basically, GDPR's perspective is that this is one of the most fascinating parts of GDPR, that even you get certificates from 10 different organizations and experts, if you can still not defend why you made this choice to collect this data and you're not actually reasoning through it, you're still going to get fined. And this tells me one thing about GDPR in its nature, that the exposure needs to be proportionate to the threat that it's imposing. For instance, if you're literally sharing a pitch deck with ChatGPT and all of the information is literally out there in the system, you don't need to worry about this, because the backlash of your even pre-funding, pre-seed startup is not going to have kind of infrastructural level of catastrophic consequences, because that's your scale. But when you have so many household names, then it becomes more complex. That's why there is even this hierarchy of privacy. When big law firms, they still feed the data to an AI model for the documents review and maybe even for the ROPA thing, because ROPA is basically bite hunting. Either juniors do it or AI does it. So they flip a coin every single day. And how it works is that because this is a kind of very sensitive data regarding a very large corporation, they just minimize the exposure. That okay, ChatGPT is not going to be adequate for this company, but if it's a kind of locally controlled data center and LLM model, um, it still is going to be proportionate to the risk and to the enablements of speed and delivery kind of precision that they're expecting. So I think from the GDPR's perspective, it's more the matter of proportionality rather than just a flat out yes or no.
Sure. And that makes sense. And kind of what we're also hinting at is getting into the architectures, because especially when you start with a small company, they don't have the resources, they don't have the architecture, they don't have any of the requirements set up in place to properly protect it. What's that tipping point between the small company and the larger companies, between when they need to start doing that? Because you mentioned the word risk, which is one of my favorite words. Why, what point does that risk become too high and the investment of infrastructure need to come in from a data sovereignty perspective, or even a process, using advanced um, data flow diagrams, et cetera, that branch out into multiple companies and understanding how their data is flowing and what are their legal restrictions that go into their data at their place, and have you done the third party risk and all of those other things to make sure that you're protecting the data properly.
To be honest, that's a fascinating question that, yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought about. But what comes to mind thinking out loud is that, at least from my own perspective, I would take it from different perspectives. That one of them is the social exposure and how much social pressure that exact brand has, and what is the actual numbers that it can back up, and you assess the risk based on that. One of the more kind of concrete examples is Adido. in the Netherlands that is a phone service provider.
Okay.
And yeah, and it was hacked this year actually. And it was like about um, yeah, it was like 6.5 million kind of people's data sold on black market. And this exposure tells me that this is a serious case that could be the risk assessment and exposure because of the brand's name and the perception of, because at the end of the day, for me, risk is perception management, the skill of perception management. And the perception management when it comes to Adido, at least for me, is that because this is literally the best, largest kind of telephone provider across the Netherlands, this needs to be taken quite seriously because the consequences of this are massive and are already in place. Uh, Two or three of Adidas competitors after the hack and its poor kind of handling of the situation have literally lowered their prices to take its place as the best providers across the country because that risk management was so handled so poorly that, as you said, what is the threshold between a small company and a large company? One of the anchors that I would say is the social perception of it. How big does the company feel? What is the presence of the company over day-to-day perception of people in feeling secure about their data and about sharing their data? Some companies could be very large in the actual business aspect of it, but in people's perspective and in people's perception of that company, they may not have a pivotal role to play. And when they are exposed, maybe people are gonna treat it less harshly than what is a small company in scale, but has a kind of a trending influence over kind of a public opinion.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I do like that. But I do want to jump on one of the topics that we spoke about prior to this. You had a lot of interest in the IBM Sovereign Core. For those who are not familiar with it, what is it trying to solve and why does it resonate with you?
Yeah, IBM Sovereign Core is quite an interesting idea because basically what it tries to solve is that now we have a problem where no one knows where the data is. Every like breadcrumb or every coin, going back to the treasure chest analogy, every coin is spread out throughout the world because of AI and all of the big data problem that is literally covering the globe. So IBM is trying to make it a container, basically one container, one room. So all of the coins are gonna stay inside this room. But the main problem with that is that, sure, we're going to have less scattered data and we're going to know where the data is sitting and we can literally pinpoint every piece of coin in the room. But the main point is the key to this room is still IBM, which is still US, which is going to literally um, uh, kind of accelerate the tension between US and Europe because the main point, the whole kind of story is around European data leaving Europe and going to US. And there is a Cloud Act that based on kind of national security, they have every access they want to European data. And IBM is not solving that. It's actually facilitating that for this tension to happen. So that's one of the problems. But what is kind of a positive point of IBM is the problem awareness. Because 2 years ago, sovereignty was not even a word. Like I literally wrote a thesis on cyber sovereignty, and it was an alien word to the academia space as well as the practitioners, because sovereignty has always been, and this is the core kind of theme of the thesis, that sovereignty has always been associated with physical reality. After the Montevideo Convention, and a state state is understood to have a physical territory. But what means that, okay, what about when the territory is gone? Do we still have concepts such as sovereignty and control? Of course we do, because the physical association of the concept was the expression of this mode of sovereignty being externalized in physical reality rather than saying, okay, sovereignty by nature is a kind of a physical concept. It is not. It is actually a density-based concept, which we could go deeper into how it is a density-based concept, but yeah.
Okay. And that makes sense. And to me, though, when you talk about sovereignty, I've heard it in concepts here and there. It isn't in common use. But, for example, in architecting some data centers, we couldn't have the analysts necessarily getting all the data from Europe, pulling it in, but they could, for example, view the data and have the data accessed and sent over to a European place if they were looking at that. So there's a lot of interesting rules when you start to break down what does sovereignty mean, what kind of access is that? Is you talking about one or two pieces of information, but what happens if you go a little bit further than that? Do you have any thoughts along those lines that you'd like to add?
To be honest, there's a threshold, and this is basically the analogy I use is about, let's say, take a pre-mapping era that, let's say, there were 100,000 soldiers in the capital, and the same representation of the same empire was one soldier in the outskirts of a village. That one soldier represented the whole empire because there was this necessity and this kind of proportionality to the presence of empire in every kind of city. You could not have 20,000 soldiers in every city because the importance was different. And the way you're describing this hierarchy of accessibility is basically that. Based on the impact and the sensitivity of the data and the infrastructural and sovereign effect of those data pieces, you could have a hierarchy of accessibility. And as you said, someone can view the data in Europe from US because that specific kind of data is not going to be as, let's say, as heavy of a kind of influence on how the whole system is running. We also have it in kind of NIS2 and the CRA as well. That is kind of breaking data types into chunks that are either infrastructural or are important, but they're not integral to the whole running of the country or at some points like the continent. And this is the proportionality test that I propose to be kind of undertaken when it comes to accessibility to every kind of data type.
Interesting. So there's a lot of judgment involved, is what I'm hearing. It's not like a black or white thing. It's where are we starting to move through. So anyway, so starting to move towards the end of the discussion here, just a few last questions. But what do you think from a European perspective, organizations are getting right about data sovereignty?
That's quite an intriguing question as well. To be honest, what they're getting right is the problem awareness, because now everyone is freaking out about, okay, what is my AI doing? What is the bias mitigation tactic for it? What is the human in the loop? Not because of the fines specifically, but because it is also integral to how their businesses is run. Because if you say, okay, I need them, let's say from the GDPR perspective, I need just your name and your phone number. I don't need your email. But you take the email anyways. You get fined for it. That doesn't interfere with how you run the business. It's just extra information and you're going to get fined for it. But when you're literally kind of working with AI, and if you don't know like what my AI is going to actually produce, it interferes with how you run the business itself. So the problem is more in your face than kind of collecting extra data that would happen previously. But now it's so integral part of running the business itself that people are being more and more problem aware.
Okay. So let's get into the final question here. So if you could change one assumption that executives have about data sovereignty, what would that be and why?
Yeah, that's my favorite question. To be honest, this is gonna be quite a philosophical answer because it's not only touches upon the core tension that is the root cause of every kind of problem we're having in the sovereignty, data sovereignty space, but also it's the continuation of my own thesis as well. If I could change one thing, is the perception about sovereignty and control, that they're not physical by nature, they are density based. And when they are density based, you have a hierarchy of either you have a hierarchy of privacy, you have hierarchy of accessibility, and you have the proportionality test of what exposure of data is dealing damage to the core infrastructure and business model. But without this perception change, with literally shoehorning physical reality and physical kind of territoriality into sovereignty, you have the same problem repeating all over again. But yeah, if I could change something with a snap of my finger today, is that everyone would literally believe sovereignty and control by nature in concept are notions that are density based rather than physical.
Okay, that makes sense. So, any final thoughts from your standpoint that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, thank you for for the questions. It was quite intellectually challenging, and also thank you for inviting me. I have one more question for you. That what is your biggest worry going forward with all of the regulations? Because we have literally changing on daily basis regulations in Europe, and there is some tension with IBM in the US. I've heard a couple of things in Japan and Canada. What would be your biggest worries going forward regarding the digital sovereignty?
I think keeping up. I mean, you almost said it right there without saying it because there's just
Yeah.
so much that's happening. I know there are, and I'm going to use the term GRC, even though it's a little bit different, GRC tools that are out there that do nothing but keep up with the regulations because that is almost a full-time job. And in the United States, for example, what's happening because we don't have strong privacy standards nationally, we're getting all kinds of standards showing up all over the country and they're growing. Sometimes they're accepted, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're shot down, and they all are different from one another. You know, like there's a New York Shield Act. I'm in New York City. There's a New York Shield
Yeah.
Act. You know, if you have passwords and things, as you were talking about the passwords earlier, Shield Act was the first thing that came to my mind. So I would say that is a big challenge. I do think that you need to have good relationships, like, for example, CISOs need to have good relationship with their lawyers. That's one of the reasons why we as CISOs can't keep up with all the laws. Most lawyers can't keep up with all the laws. You need tools to go collect that, especially if you're an international company. It gets to be a much larger challenge. I mean, I could spend an hour talking about that right there, but in a nutshell, that's the biggest concern. And then where are you going to drop the ball? Then it's all the third party stuff. Everything that we've talked about, it's the same problems between the US and Europe. Just I think the consequences are higher in Europe due to the regulatory requirements compared to the United States, even though we have certain areas like California that are much stronger from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're moving so fast that the regulations are barely keeping up after 2 years of the innovation already having happened.
Right. So, anyway, Mahdi, I want to thank you very much for your time today. You've got a lot of expertise in this. To me, this was also a very enlightening conversation that we had. It gave me some food for thought. I'm hoping that people are listening, especially if they're more interested in what's going on in Europe. Those are really applicable over here too, but in slightly different ways, as we discussed during this. So, thank you very much for your time today. You were a fantastic guest, and hopefully, we'll see you again in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you.